Ethics Untangled is brought to you by IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. To find out more about IDEA, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics. Tim Watkin is a journalist and media manager. He works as executive editor for audio at Radio New Zealand. But he's currently on sabbatical at the University of Glasgow, studying how to rebuild trust in journalism as part of a project on epistemic autonomy. In this interview, we'll be discussing the nature of trust, why it's important, why journalists seem to be losing the public's trust, whose fault this is, and what might be done about it. Tim, welcome to the podcast.
Kia ora. As we say in New Zealand, g'day, Jim, very nice to be here. And kia ora koutou to everyone listening.
Good to have you. Okay, so I wondered if you could start by saying a bit about what your background is and how you came to be interested in the ideas of trust in journalism.
Sure. Look, I've been a journalist for something like 30 years. I've been a daily news reporter, a feature writer, a TV executive producer, and I'm currently in charge of podcasts and digital audio at RNZ, which is New Zealand's state broadcaster. Imagine like BBC Radio or NPR in the States or that kind of thing. And look, I've seen a real change in people's approach to journalism, the public's view of journalism over that time. I also write a fair bit of political analysis and commentary, and have done over the years. And I'm a sucker for engaging with people who like to throw their 2 cents back at me. And look, on Twitter and emails and so forth, I've seen the way the civility has dripped away. The discourse has got nastier, and amongst all of that, it's really, really clear that people's trust for, look, a lot of public institutions, and we can get into this later, but it extends through government and business and all kinds of institutions, but for journalism specifically, has really fallen. And what was initially called a slow motion collapse of trust is become something of an avalanche in recent years. And I think we should all be deeply concerned about that.
Yeah. So we'll get onto why we might think that trust has diminished in journalism and what to do about it in a moment. But I just wanted to ask you, first of all, what do you think counts as journalism? Because I suppose background, or part of the background to this, is the fact that, people who might count themselves as journalists, or if not as journalists, as doing something that's a bit like journalism, have become a bit more kind of varied and distributed, right? Since the advent of social media and so on. So we have like YouTubers or kind of hyper partisan online newspapers and so on. We have kind of columnists. There's a lot of columnists, people with, more or less of an agenda that they're bringing to their writing and so on. Activist journalists. I mean, is it possible to kind of draw some kind of neat lines around journalism so that we can say this is journalism and this isn't?
They're not particularly neat lines, I don't think. Jim, sadly, they're quite fuzzy lines with lots of little dashes and breaks in them. But I think it's increasingly important too. I think that the more I've looked into this and the more I've researched that I've done in recent weeks, the more I think one of the key issues is that we have lost control of the definition of journalism, for all of those reasons that you laid out. I think social media has had a huge impact, because there is so much out there now that is media or content, as we talk about. And I started this, the pitch that I put to my bosses to allow me to come and do this research was headlined, Rebuilding Trust in Media. But it became very clear to me very quickly as I got into this that, in a way, media is the wrong word, because people can be perfectly trustworthy of Game of Thrones or their favourite novelist, or saying to someone the other day they might have issues about the Marvel universe or something, but they trust a lot of what we would call media. And look, you're right. There's a lot of content out there on social, but also just in a broader digital world that looks like journalism. And there's the whole thing that if it looks like something and sounds like something and quacks like something, it is something. Well, it's not in this case, I don't think. I think, just because it walks and sounds and quacks like journalism, it doesn't mean it's journalism. There's a lot of stuff out there that is deeply partisan or deeply flawed or just downright wrong, be it from, right to the kind of flat earth, there are lizards living amongst us, QAnon type stuff, which can be presented with headlines and inverted pyramid stories and nicely broken paragraphs and photos and things that look like what you get from your daily news coverage that just obviously is not journalism. And so I think increasingly it's really important for us to talk about, that journalism, involves what? It involves gathering information from multiple sources. And that means building networks of those sources, treating them fairly, protecting them when we need to, but still scrutinizing the information we get, challenging it by going to others. So making sure there's balance in those stories, dealing fairly with the information we have, being very transparent about who we're speaking to, and how we're gathering that information, being objective in the way we do it, so we deal with it impartially. And the key thing, and I'll quote journalism professors Bill Kovach and Tom Reisenstahl, who's written, in the end, the discipline of verification is what separates journalism from entertainment, propaganda, fiction, or art. And I think somehow trying to communicate to people that we check stuff is really important.
Yeah, it sounds like the way you're trying to define journalism there, it has some quite strong normative elements to it, right? So it's in a way a kind of matter of values, right? So what distinguishes journalists from non-journalists is going to turn out to be something like, something, I don't know, some kind of relation to the truth maybe, or some kind of value of truth-telling, or like you say, of verification, but of course... Go on, sorry.
Yeah, true. I mean, at least facts, maybe. Truth is such a difficult word. I really grapple with that. And a lot of people do, and a lot of people in this area of research do talk about truth and the importance of bringing it back to some kind of shared truth and shared reality. Because obviously once that breaks down and everything's relativistic and everything's your own truth and so forth, then you really can't have a good conversation about how to run a society or what what baseline minimums we can agree on, even if we disagree on much. But truth is such a slippery word. But I think at least these values, the normative values that come back to things like fairness and accuracy and balance. And as I say, the fact that we verify stuff, we don't just go to print with the latest rumor we've heard on the street or what some guy said on Twitter. Yes, and that is different. The guy could have might right, but he hasn't gone through a process. It's not a method. And that's I think really key. And I think a lot of people consuming the media these days aren't necessarily seeing that distinction. And so it's on us to better label it and better, lay that out for people.
Yeah. So it's some kind of method of verification and at least of checking facts. And it's systematic to some extent. So there's going to be certain sort of recognized techniques for doing so that are going to be shared among journalists, right? But I suppose what it's not going to be is going to be that in order to be a journalist, you have to work for a newspaper or a TV company or something like that, right? So there's not going to be any kind of institutional restrictions on it.
It would be unfair because there are people out there who are doing great journalism who are doing it on their own bat. And you don't want to be too restrictive in terms of drawing those that the slightly fuzzy line that we're drawing. If we draw it too tightly around us, then we're just going to, I think, annoy people and exclude, as I say, independent people who are doing journalism off their own bat. But I think it is important to I still think actually, heritage brands become increasingly important in this because, and you don't want to stop innovation, you don't want to stop new brands and new ways of journalism coming through, but I think it is hugely important that, and we've seen, and this comes up in the research too, that people, when they talk about what they trust, familiarity and heritage often come out as a kind of a shortcut to trust.
Right.
BBC's been around forever. That must make them relatively trustworthy, and that can save certain brands too. Like there are plenty of times when journalism has failed itself. Even in the relatively noble last 100 years where we've tried to be an objective profession, there's been plenty of examples. from the Russian letters the Daily Mail printed before the 1924 election here in the UK, to weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, to the kind of stuff, the recorded phone hacking and so forth that was going on. There are plenty of things where we've not met those standards and not done the process, the method that I'm talking about. But that just, hopefully we get judged by, that's the exception, not the rule.
Yes, I suppose the examples, well, particularly the example of phone hacking, what that also suggests that it's probably not going to, well, maybe this isn't definitional. Maybe this is going to come in terms of like a set of values or principles that you think journalists should be following, but it's not just about verification, right? So I take it the problem with the phone hacking case wasn't that what was being reported wasn't kind of true or factually true. It was that it was a gross invasion of privacy. It was, disrespectful towards people, and it was also not in the public interest, I suppose. So there might be a kind of public interest element to this as well. So there's going to be other values at play as well as verification.
In a way, you could argue that the phone hacking was a group of journalists being very serious about verification. They were making sure that what they were reporting was accurate. But you're right, they were doing it. It's where the Venn diagram comes together. They were doing it. Look, I mean, I guess they were probably doing it following an objective method, and they probably were checking that against other sources. If they heard someone saying something, they would probably, they'd go and put it to an official source to get some comment. There was but what's missing in that Venn diagram is the transparency part of it, because they were doing it surreptitiously and dishonestly, and so that's part of the failure there. And you're right, the public interest is a really good point. It's interesting. It's something that again pops up in the research a little bit, that people have started to see journalism as too tied to vested interests and too tied to either a profit motive or as part of the establishment, which is interesting, because journalists often hold themselves up as, and maybe we lack a little bit of humility and self-awareness in this regard, but we often hold ourselves up as the heroes holding the establishment to account and constantly checking on the establishment. But for a lot of the public, they see us as just another part of that establishment. And that is a problem. We need to probably, again, be better at communicating that, both in the way we communicate with the public, but also in what we do, communicate it by in what we actually do, by being more clearly citizen first, you might say, not part of the establishment. We're not here to serve the sources that we have, or the government of the day, or the corporations that even we work for. That we really have to quite seriously be citizen first. And if that costs our corporation money, or if it does damage to the other establishments of the day, then that's not our problem, right? Our problem is our priority is that truth, whatever you call it, but the facts, and in service of that public interest.
Yeah. Okay. But what you're specifically interested in is trust, right? So you're doing this research about trust in journalism and how that might be restored. So what conclusions have you come to about what trust is?
Well, look, it's very different things in different contexts. It is, I'm attached to the philosophy department here at Glasgow University, and they will say, a philosopher will say, that is something like an attitude or expectation of a trustee, that a trustor will act in a certain consistent way. Some will say that it's an optimistic belief. Some will not necessarily include that, but will say that there is a confidence that the person that you are trusting will act competently and in the manner expected, and that in doing so, you will make yourself vulnerable to betrayal. And so, the really key elements of trust, philosophically, I think, are risk and relationship. Trust is always relational, and it always puts the trustee at risk, because you might be misled or deceived if you trust your partner and they cheat on you. If you trust your plumber to be here at 2:00 and they don't turn up till 5, if you trust a newspaper to give you an accurate story and it doesn't, then you are betrayed, and that does damage.
Okay, and betrayal sounds to me like a moral notion, right? So are you thinking of trust as being a kind of moral concept? So if we trust people, there's always and if a breach of trust, for example, is always going to be some kind of a moral breach, right? It's going to be somebody letting you down in a moral sense, rather than just not doing what you expected them to do in a sort of non-moral way. If that makes sense.
Yes, I mean, I'm not looking at it hugely through a moral lens, but you're right that there is that there is a belief, the very clear, I think, largely agreed belief that trust goes beyond mere reliability. That it's one thing to think that someone's reliable, but yes, that's a chair can be reliable. Where a microphone we're speaking into could be, we can rely on this microphone to communicate between us. But if this microphone suddenly breaks and we go silent, we're not going to feel afraid by that microphone, right? But if you suddenly cut me off, I might feel betrayed by you personally. If you mute my mic and start telling me that all journalists are evil or something, then I might so my trust in you in that stage kind of starts to break down. So or if I start swearing now, your trust in me is going to be so. Yes, there's a moral element there, but it's. I think the key bit is the relationship thing, right? That breaks down.
It's I suppose you could also think about it in terms of expectation, right? So if I expect you not to suddenly start swearing, it's not just that I think most likely you won't suddenly start swearing, right? It's not that kind of expectation. It's I have a legitimate expectation of you that, there are certain kind of rules of engagement when we're doing something like recording a podcast, and you're not going to suddenly go maverick and start insulting me.
Well, Jim, I really want to start swearing right now. Just break the rules. I would not breach our trust.
Right. So that's roughly what trust is. And you're interested in trust in journalism. And so you said quite clearly at the start of the conversation that you think journalists are losing the trust of the public, or at least the public is losing trust in journalists. So what's the evidence for that? Where does that idea come from?
Look, I mean, there is plenty of data out there. As I say, I mean, certainly my personal experience speaks to that. I think most journalists will see that in their daily lives in terms of but look, the data is there. I'm just looking here. All over the world, the Reuters Institute at Oxford does quite a lot of research into this. They've got trust in news at 40% this year. 40% of people express a trust in news. That seems to have stabilised over the last year or two. But if you go back further in various studies like Gallup in the US, has been doing this since the 70s. In the 1976, 72% of people said they had a great deal or fair amount of trust in mass media. So 72% in the 70s, 36% in 2021. In New Zealand, where I'm from, they've just been researching the last 5 years. You're talking about 53%, I think, trust in 2020. This year, 33%. So you're seeing a 20% drop in trust in the media in 5 years in a country like New Zealand. So this is what I mean about the slow motion collapse turning into a bit of an avalanche. It feels like people are struggling, and I think a lot of listeners won't be surprised, right? They look at social media and see these kind of comments coming up. What do we believe? What's real? What's not? Everyone uses the phrase fake news now. We see politicians in many countries turning on the media in a way that they would never have 10 years ago. From Donald Trump's media as the enemy of the people, through to slightly more nuanced ways, but also across various parts of Asia and Africa and Eastern Europe, the media is being presented as the bad guys, and some people not to be trusted.
What do you think of the underlying reasons for that? Because I suppose, thinking about the way people like Trump have described journalists and the media in the past, it kind of strikes me he's not originating that, right? It's not that he's creating distrust in the media. I mean, he probably is. He's probably exacerbating it by the way he's talking about journalists, but it's there already, right? And he's playing on it. It's kind of, he's using it to his advantage, a distrust that's already there. So I wondered, do you think, to what extent do you think people in power talking in this way about journalists and the media is creating the mistrust, or what other factors do you think are at play in generating that?
It's certainly they are pushing that snowball down the hill and adding to it. But no, you're right. Look, any list I give you, I'm going to leave some things out. But for example, there's the kind of things that I've mentioned in terms of media making very high profile mistakes, weapons of mass destruction, phone hacking, those kind of things, where we have certainly made it pretty clear to people that in some cases we weren't worthy of their trust, and so that's on us. There is the sheer avalanche of information that we get now with social media. And so the stuff, again, we talked about in terms of it's just all the stuff out there in content land, which some of which is high quality and some of which isn't. And so people struggle to tell the difference. There are genuine bad faith actors, which we've, again, probably all read the stories about, the bot farms in various countries that are actively putting out misinformation and disinformation to try and confuse and divide people. There are really practical business reasons. Journalism used to be a very profitable business. It is not now, or certainly not in the same way that it was. I worked in newsrooms 20 years ago in New Zealand that are a third the size today of what they were then. It's come home very real in New Zealand this year. News Hub, one of our TV news organisations, literally shut their doors a few months ago. For your British listeners, imagine if ITV News suddenly said, "We run out of money, we can't keep going." Yeah. That has happened in New Zealand. That has actually happened. A large TV network has said, "We are stopping doing news. We'll keep running, our Love Islands and so forth, but the news is too expensive. We're done." So in New Zealand now we have a single, basically the BBC left doing TV news, and that's it. So journalists are under all kinds of pressure, and are not always doing as good a job as they would have done a generation ago, because they just don't have the time, and there's fewer of them. So all of these reasons, contribute to a pretty difficult, challenging picture.
Hello. This is just a brief interruption to tell you about an event that IDEA the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds is hosting as part of its 20th anniversary celebrations this year. We're delighted to be welcoming Gavin Esler, journalist, presenter and author, to present a public lecture, Dead Cats, Strategic Lying and Truth Decay, on the evening of Tuesday, 17th of June, at Clothall Court in Leeds. Gavin is an award-winning journalist, broadcaster and author. He's best known for presenting the BBC's flagship Newsnight programme. He also spent a number of years as the BBC's chief North American correspondent, as well as reporting in other countries. He's the author of 5 novels and 4 non-fiction books commenting on politics in the modern world. Drawing on his recent book, Britain is Better Than This, Gavin will analyse the state of current politics and truth-telling in the public realm. He will argue that people no longer trust businesses or politicians or journalists as much as they used to, and that this is the result of what he calls the politics of distraction. He will discuss how a loss of trust and truth decay is eating away some of the core principles of democracy in the United Kingdom, the United States, and elsewhere, and will suggest how trust and truth can be reinforced. You can book your place at the event by going to our website at ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics and clicking on the link to find out about our 20th anniversary events. We'll also put a link in the show notes for this podcast. Thanks. Now back to the interview. I mean, I take it it's not just that there's a kind of lack of resource and lack of money in journalism anymore. Journalistic organisations not as big or as powerful as they used to be, but it's also the way we consume news or comment or opinion or information or whatever it is. It's no longer the case that you can rely on a steady audience, right? So back in the day, a newspaper would have had a solid readership, and whatever it printed, really, I mean, its readership might kind of fluctuate, but more or less it would have a kind of core readership that it could rely on. Same with TV channels, right? There was probably, most people in this country would either watch BBC or ITV, and that's how they would get most of their news. So they just would stick to that one channel. And, it's nothing like that anymore. I mean, personally, actually, I tend to use social media as a news aggregator. That's how I tend to get my news. So I'll just I will follow a link to an individual article rather than going onto the website of a particular newspaper and reading the whole newspaper. I do have subscriptions to some newspapers, but I very rarely just go and read the whole newspaper.
Yeah.
But it means that these organizations are competing for people's attention, right? So the incentives just aren't good in terms of, what the kinds of things that you were talking about when it's, that kind of systematic verification of stories takes resource, right? And it takes time. And there's a strong incentive to, well, I mean, one thing would be confirmation bias, right? So when people don't really know who to trust, one of the things that they kind of tend to rely on is this person telling me what I kind of tend to think is true, or what are they kind of confirming my own views, right?
Yeah.
So it's easy to just kind of, everything fragments into these little tribes where people are kind of feeding people things that accord with their prior convictions rather than trying to tell them something that they might not have already come across.
A couple of key words in there. You said that thing's fragmented, and fragmentation has been huge in this. You're right that there was a critical mass around certain media brands, and they could rely on a certain amount of income from that. That's gone because there are just so many options now in terms of where you can get your news and information. You mentioned and look, that's a huge thing. Google and Meta and these companies are now sucking up so much. I mean, the vast majority, not even just the majority, the bulk of the advertising dollars out there. So the ability to actually pay for journalism for non-public broadcasters is really challenged because, these big multinationals have now, because to say, I mock you gently, but because you're looking at stuff through social, the money is going to Zuckerberg or Musk, not to your local newspaper. So that is a real challenge. The other thing you mentioned there is tribe, and I think there's a real because there are all these options there now. There is this tribe over truth thing going on where people want to belong more than they want the difficult truth. So people always say with news, just give us the facts and, tell us how it is. But in many cases, when you've got a news platform that is happy to provide you the information from a certain point of view and to confirm your biases, as you say, then you'll prefer that because that's familiar, that's safe. And this powerful need to belong will discourage you from actually going, oh, maybe this group of people I'm all surrounded by have all got caught up in the wrong idea, and apply that thinking to any group. It's not just necessarily MAGA. It could be, anybody, left, right, centre, authoritarian, liberal, what you take your pick, religious, whatever. You're in a group where you want to belong, and you like your ideas to be affirmed. And there are plenty of news outlets there happy to do that these days, because from a commercial point of view, a good, strong niche audience is something you can take to the bank. And so, you can make sure that you've got pay for your journalists and so forth. So, that's a real problem. And again, probably makes it very difficult for a lot of commercial media to make good choices, but also makes public media all the more important to be able to make sure that they are playing a straight bat.
Sorry, what do you mean by public media? So kind of like the BBC and stuff like that? Yeah.
Publicly funded. So they don't have to sell ads. The media doesn't have to sell ads to survive.
Okay. So it's a very, very challenging environment for journalists to operate in. So what kinds of things do you think journalists can do to try to survive in that environment, but also to try to regain the trust of the public and of their readers?
Well, see, that's exactly what I'm trying to figure out, Jim. And if I could tell you in the next minute or so, then I'd be a very rich person. But I think there are there is a lot of research going on in this area, and it's the good news, I think, for journalists is that certainly to my mind, this is not uncharted territory, and I think the solutions are actually things that we probably know how to do. There are technology issues and many unknown unknowns and AI and various things that are going to challenge this. But at a more basic level, and those are things we can't necessarily control and are very complex. But objectivity and some of the impartial rules of journalism that I think most people describe to journalism, and this is interesting. A lot of the research will tell you that is what people think when the public talk about journalism. They do expect impartiality and so forth. And some journalists have given that away. Some journalists have said, "Oh, transparency is the new objectivity. It's fine as long as we're honest. We can't. Everyone knows we're biased. We can't. No human cannot be biased. So let's just not even try, and let's just be honest about it. And the transparency will people will forgive us as long as we're transparent." I don't think they will. I do think that I think people have seen enough media in enough journalism in the movies, and they still are the idea of journalism as impartial and objective is deeply embedded in people's expectations. And secondly, if we don't stick to some of these impartial objective rules, then we're kind of giving away our superpower, the thing that makes us different. Right at the beginning, I said, what is journalism? We've actually got that furry line around what we are becomes so much more important if we're trying to say to people, hey, we are not this other stuff. You can trust us. Then I think we need to get back to the basics. And when I say we've done this before, if you go back to the yellow journalism of 100 years ago or 130 years ago, especially in the US, there was, wild made-up stories, and media it was brutal competing in 1890s, early 1900s. There's great stories about the Globe and the World and the various Eastern Seaboard papers in America, and pushing America into war with Cuba, and just because there was this competition for very much alternative facts. And it was really after World War One that there was a real effort across the industry to bring in some discipline, and that discipline was objectivity, to say stop making stuff up, stop being paid by this political party or the other one, because early papers in a lot of countries were funded by, if not political parties, then political grants. Stop doing this and step back and do it differently. And that differently was objectivity. Now, there's been a lot of criticism of objectivity, and it doesn't work without that transparency. Objectivity on its own can be pretty bland. It can be pretty, people, would not like a lot of it, to be honest, because it will just be today so-and-so did this and so did that, and we become stenographers rather than journalists. And one of the big criticisms of it is that you get false equivalency, that and minority voices don't get heard. You just get the status quo repeating itself.
Right.
And that's a reasonable criticism. But there's someone like Christiane Amanpour has a really good quote around objectivity, which says, what it commits you to is giving all sides a fair hearing, that you go and listen to all sides, but it doesn't mean you have to treat all sides the same. And imagine from her scenario, the reporting in the Balkans in the 90s and in Rwanda and so forth. Just because you go and speak to all sides, or, the easy one for people's heads is to put yourself in Germany in the early 1930s. You go and speak to the Nazis because they are a powerful party that is changing your country, but you don't necessarily just say Nazis say this, the other people say that. You can say the Nazis are saying this, but I've gone away to verify that, and it's simply not true. It turns out socialists and Jews and gays are not vermin, and they are actually human, and they, you can challenge the fact, the view you get with verification of fact. And so it's that powerful combination that we talked about at the beginning that I think is what we can do. And I think the main thing we can do is probably get way better at saying this. I can imagine I'd like to see more newspapers on their mastheads, on their homepages, being really clear about what their promise is. What is it that, that we are journalists here, and this is what that means. If you're on this website or if you're reading the story, you can expect these standards. If we make our mistakes, here are really prominent corrections of those mistakes. We don't hide them down the bottom of stories. If we, there are some cool things that are being tried around the world, like what have been called ingredients lists or process boxes, where you have your story that you do, and then you have a box or something even inside the story which says, for this story, I rang 9 people, 2 said no comment, this 2 more didn't want to be named for these reasons. The rest are Joe, Matilda, Margaret, and Bruce. And I looked at these facts, and here's a link to this official document to show you the facts. Or we might say, this is a story on suicide. We don't often cover suicide, but here is our suicide policy of when we do cover it, and this is what we don't tell you, and this is what we tell you, and this is why. Or this is how we cover politics, or whatever. So there's a lot more explaining how the cake gets made, rather than just like, here's a cake.
That sounds good. I mean, so is part of that being really clear about the distinction between facts and opinions as well? Because
absolutely,
yeah. So like I think that must be quite difficult for journalists, because when you're reporting on something, say a politician has said, a great deal of what they're saying is going to be opinion, but there's going to be kind of facts in amongst it, and it's not often clear it's often not clear what elements of what's being said are facts and what are opinions. But if someone's saying something like the immigrants are eating people's pets, right, that's either true or it's not, and therefore it would be good.
No one would say that, surely.
For example, just to pull an example out of midair, it's either true or it's not.
Years ago, that would have been a ridiculous example.
That's exactly, yeah. And it would be good to pick those things out and actually just kind of be quite robust about pushing back when things are just factually untrue that people are saying, I suppose.
Yeah, it is, and it is hard, because it was interesting. Let's not forget that when that statement was made during that debate, to his credit, the journalist moderating that debate immediately said,
right,
I'm afraid, sir, that is not correct. We have checked that, and the city administrator says that is not happening. So that is good journalism. That is really good journalism, to know and to be ready for that. Because, there are a lot of things that somebody might have said that you can't necessarily be ready for all things, but that was good. But we need to be better at checking those things and being really clear what is opinion. There's 2 levels of accuracy in that kind of story, especially when you're quoting politicians and strong views. There is the accuracy of quoting them accurately, right? If the first and basic obligation of a journalist is to quote, in this case, Trump accurately, to saying this is what he said. He said that they were eating the dogs and the cats, not that they were eating the dogs, the cats, and the mice, or just the dogs. You need to quote that accurately. There's and sometimes people appear like get confused, going, "Well, that's not accurate." Well, it is. It's accurate that he said it. And it is an important part of journalism to report that, so that people can then go, "Oh, do I want to vote for a guy who says that?" So you don't want to just go straight to the fact checking. You've got to actually let someone speak. You've got to give them the right of speech and to say what they want to say, and then so that people can judge them on their character and policy and what they say. But then there's a second level of accuracy, which says, well, is the thing that the person is saying actually accurate? And we can do that job as well and go, and it might not happen on the spot always, but you can say, well, actually, Donald Trump said they're eating the dogs and the cats. And so we went to Springfield, and a lot of media did go to Springfield and spoke to a lot of people, and went and to their credit, a lot of, you might have seen the reports that actually went back to seemingly the woman whose Facebook post that claim was based on, who said very specifically, I got this secondhand from a neighbor and I realized I got it wrong and I pulled my Facebook, blah, blah, blah. So that is, again, good reporting of that investigation. If a journalist doesn't do that, then all you've got is the politician saying it. So it's a really good example of why journalism matters.
Yeah, that's a really good description of how journalists should be approaching their work. We've probably just got time for one more question. I was wondering, is an element of this, of the solution, to be thought about on a more of an institutional level? So some of the stuff you've been saying about, journalism as a kind of set of more or less systematic methods or practices, right? And it's maybe with some values instantiated in it as well, those kinds of things. It reminds me of the way people talk about professions. I think you did use the word profession at one point, but I don't know whether you meant that in a kind of robust sense, in the same way that we might say doctors and lawyers are professionals. I think there's probably some resistance to using that word in the case of journalism, actually. But it just occurred to me that, right, so thinking about medicine as an example, I mean, there's lots of kind of shady medicine out there. There's lots of kind of pseudo medicine or kind of quack remedies and things like that, and things that aren't verified and are just kind of very flaky. But there's a kind of core profession of medicine which, not everybody trusts those people, but there's a reasonably robust public trust in that profession, right? Now, why is that? I mean, I suppose there's all sorts of reasons for it. And I suppose one reason why you might be wary about applying this to journalism is because I suppose one reason is actually, if you're a doctor and you act badly or act against the kind of code of ethics or whatever, you can be struck off, right? So there's actually a license to practice there. And you might think you wouldn't want to bring in something like a license to practice in journalism, I suppose, because there's a kind of there's an assumption that there should be a great deal of freedom, I suppose, about like who can go and, apply these checks to the powerful and speak truth to power and so on. You wouldn't want kind of institutions saying who could and couldn't do that. But is there something that could be done on an institutional level to try to kind of create that trust in journalism as an institution rather than just an individual journalist?
A really good question. I have kept coming back to doctors and lawyers. You're right that you've got to be careful. A lot of journalists will talk about their craft or their trade rather than their profession, but I think there is. And look, there are professional standards. There are media regulators in most countries, which do a pretty good job. I sit on the Media Council in New Zealand. Have done for 8 years, and so if you complain about a piece of journalism, it will get and you are not satisfied with the response, the correction of the news organisation you're dealing with, then you can go to an arbiter. Ofcom, Ipso, and Press in the UK. There are a number of organisations. Again, I think they could probably be more prominent, and and journalists could probably make more of them to show people, look, we do have these professional checks in place. But you're right. I think it's interesting to think I've actually been struck off as a journalist. It's almost a fascinating idea. But you're right. That would probably have some quite serious issues about free speech, and it also is. I know with doctors, it's life and death. I used to have a host who I used to produce in TV who always said, when I'd be cross with him about an interview he did or something, he said, look, no one died on the table. And so, journalism is not, you can have a bad day in journalism and the consequences aren't as bad as a bad day in surgery.
Well, also not as kind of immediately verifiable, right? So, I mean, if a doctor has a really bad day, the consequences are right there in front of you. For a journalist, you might just never be found out, or, people might trust you anyway because you're saying what they want to hear and so on. So it's less obvious.
Weapons of mass destruction in Iraq is a good example, right? I mean, it took we didn't, until they went in and didn't find any, we didn't know that reporting was wrong. So yeah, it does. Sometimes it's unclear. And even then, people will say, well, from a certain angle, they weren't entirely right. So yeah, it is a grey area. But look, I do think that again, part of what we were saying earlier about being clear what a journalist is and what standards we hold ourselves to as journalists would probably help us. Not to the point to say I've been struck off, perhaps, but certainly of it being clear that there are consequences for doing it badly, and that you can expect standards that are different from the quackery of I've made that comparison in some of the stuff I've been writing, but I think, good proper journalism is not the quackery of the internet. There's plenty of information quackery out there, and we need to be really careful to say that is not us. That is not what we do, for all the reasons we've talked about. So the profession does have to step up, and I think it is. I think you can see increasingly a lot of media organisations realising that this isn't a game anymore, and that's not fair. It wasn't a game, but there was your currency was your audience, that you had to win eyeballs. And if you had to be a little bit sensationalist, or if you had to be a little bit naughty to do that, in some cases a lot naughty, like phone hacking, then hey, if that's going to get you another 100,000 readers, and you do it, because that's how you survive. I think there's a recognition now that trust is our currency, that we live and die as organisations, not just on audience size and the best headline, but actually trust. And if we don't get this right, then we're screwed. So we really need to. That doesn't count as a square, does it?
You'll let you.
We have to get this right. So trust matters. It really is number one priority.
Right. Well, I don't know whether you call that an optimistic note to end on, but maybe sort of reason for some hope. Yeah. Okay.
We're doing our best, Jim. We are doing our best, and I think we'll keep doing better.
Yeah. Brilliant. All right. Well, that's all we've got time for. So, Tim Watkin, thank you very much for being on the podcast.
Pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Ethics Untangled, a podcast from IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. IDEA brings ethics to life, blending in-depth theoretical inquiry with real-world experience to address the most complex ethical issues facing the world today. If you like the podcast, please leave us a rating and review. And to find out more about IDEA, including our Masters and PhD programmes and a wide range of consultancy services we offer, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.